Bapak Gita Wirawan, Chairman BKPM, Bapak Mahendra Siregar, Vice Minister of Trade, His Royal Highness Sri Sultan Hamengkubuwono X, Sultan and Governor of Yogyakarta, Ambassador Greg Moriarty, Ambassador Primo Alui Giulianto, Senator Alan Eggleston, Consul General Gary Youssef, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce our lunchtime speaker today, Bapak Gita Wirawan, Chairman of BKPM, Indonesia's inward investment agency. The Commonwealth Bank is delighted to support this conference and is very supportive of the AIBC and the work it does on behalf of both Australian and Indonesian businesses. As we have heard this morning in the sessions today, Indonesia is not only one of the world's fastest growing economies and an increasingly attractive place to do business, but also, most importantly, is Australia's nearest neighbour. Indonesia is a very important growth market for the Commonwealth Bank. We have three very good businesses in Indonesia: our banking business, PT Commonwealth Bank, life insurance business, Commonwealth Life, and our funds management business, First State Investments Indonesia. As mentioned this morning, we are targeting to open our 100th branch this year. Currently, we have 84 bank branches and 26 life sales offices across 26 cities in Indonesia. We employ over 2,000 full-time Indonesian staff and 4,500 part-time staff. The key to our success over the last 10 years or more has been patience and partnership. We've heard quite a lot about partnership today. I think a lot of a secret of our success has been that patience, particularly taking time to understand how to do business in Indonesia in our target markets, investing significantly in our local staff and the development of key relationships. One of those relationships is with BKPM, and today I'm delighted to introduce you to Pak Gita. Pak Gita has been in the role for the last 15 months and is a highly regarded former investment banker with Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. He's also run his own private equity company, Ancora Capital. Pak Gita comes to a job with an impressive background in international business and ability to understand cross-border investment. He is well placed to lead Indonesia's campaign to promote inward investment. I'm sure that you're all keen to hear from him about the changing nature of Indonesia and why it is a very attractive investment destination. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to invite you to hear from Pak Gita.
You know, my staff are very good in organizing for me to give a speech during lunchtime so that I don't get to eat, you know, as much as they do or you do. It's good for my diet, actually. I want to first thank Jeff for helping us with this event, and of course, special thanks to Ambassador Moriarty and Ambassador Bapak Primo, and of course, special thanks to Bapak Mahendra Siregar and Bapak Sultan, and of course, everybody that's made this event successful as we've seen it all along since this morning. When Chris told me, Chris Barnes that is, told me that, you know, I should come out here and speak, and the impression I got was that I was going to be speaking in front of about 20 to 30 people, but he told me last night that the turnout is at 210, so a big applause to Chris. I want to talk about basically three things today. And the first is really about history, the history of Indonesia. And the second, I want to talk about Indonesia-Australia relationships. And the third being, you know, how to go forward, what's ahead of us. If we take a look at the first 1,000 years since the birth of Christ, Indonesia was able to basically show to the world that it was capable of building the largest, if not one of the largest, Buddhist temples in the world by the name of Borobudur. It had a thriving civilization. And in the second 1,000 years, we had a thriving civilization whose impact is felt through today in a good chunk of Southeast Asia by virtue of the existence of the kingdom of Majapahit. And if we were to make reference to the third 1,000 years since the birth of Christ, Indonesia has gone through a pretty interesting period, whether it is by virtue of our attaining our independence in 1945, or also some of the political and economic upheavals that we've gone through ever since then, whether it is the 1965 incident or the 1998 financial crisis, by virtue of which my purchasing power dropped by 85% in a couple of months because the rupiah just behaved in an out-of-the-ordinary manner within months. At that time, it would have been very tough for me to disagree with anybody in the world who would have thought that Indonesia was going to balkanize. But the fact of the matter is that Indonesia has been able to come out of the moribund economic and political scenarios that people were thinking of. Whether you call it luck or crafty workmanship from a political and economic standpoint, I think history will tell. But as it is today, Indonesia has been able to basically remain unscathed and been able to go through the democratization process quite nicely. Speaking of the democratization process, as you all know, we've gone through two sets of elections in 2004 and 2009, whereby we had a one-man, one-vote system implemented virtually with no bloodshed, as we might have seen in some other places, as some might have anticipated or expected. From an economic standpoint, we have seen the country basically show its fiscal prudence in a systematic manner to the extent where we are blessed with a debt to GDP ratio of about 26 to 27% by last year. We're blessed with our ability to manage inflationary pressures, although we had spikes of domestic demand in 2005 and 2008, but we have not had to basically raise policy rates as frequently and as much as we might have seen in countries like India, China, and Malaysia. These monetary and fiscal portraits are what I call capital for the new Indonesia. And the new Indonesia is one where we have got to take a view proactively on shaping the country for the next 1,000 years. And I think we've got a good set of capital that would be good for us to fuel ourselves forward, whether it means showing an increased ability to build something as opposed to extracting natural resources out of the ground, whether it means educating ourselves to be a better society, and surely a more educated society. I think time will tell. But this hope sits on the back of a pretty fantastic demographic dividend within the population, whereby 60% of the population are 39 years old or younger, and 50% of the population are younger than 29 years old. So it all depends on what we're going to be doing with these youthful people. And the good thing about Indonesia is we're pretty reproductive. Not only do we like to eat, but we like to reproduce. And this reproductive capacity, I think, will sustain the demographic profile in the next 15 years, unlike what we're seeing in Singapore, in Japan, and in China, potentially. So the view taking is that if we were to put money into this population, is there a good chance for this population or society to get better off in the next 5 to 10 years? At the rate that we're putting a good chunk of our money into educational purposes, and we are doing that. We're putting about 20% of our budget for educational purposes, unlike what we have seen 5, 6, 7 years ago. And that gives me real hope, which is why I took the liberty and the privilege to take a massive pay cut 15 months ago. I am one of many who believe in the future of Indonesia. And when one talks about the future of Indonesia, I think, has to involve how it deals with the rest of the world, how it deals with Australia. And that gets to the second point. The second point, in terms of the relations between Indonesia and Australia, is manifold. If we were to make reference to the speech of President SBY last year, whether it's at the Parliament or at the Business Forum, I think it was clear that there was a need, if not an urgent need, to underline the importance of the relations between the two countries. As a matter of fact, it was probably one of the very, very few points that opposition leader Tony Abbott, was in agreement with the then Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, that the relations between Indonesia and Australia ought to be prioritized. We've suffered too much, too long from stereotypical views of each other. It was quite apparent in my second trip to Australia when I gave a speech at Hayman Island in August. This was the AIBC conference, or the Australian Davos conference, where I sat with quite a bunch of what I call the elitists in Australia. And there was a sense that some, if not many, Australians think that we think negatively of you guys. And it's really not true. I can point out that all my kids think about would be, when would the next movie come out that stars Nicole Kidman, Hugh Jackman, and all these famous Australian celebrities. And all I can think of is, I can't seem to be convincing my nephews and nieces to want to go to schools in the US anymore, because they want to go to Melbourne, they want to go to Sydney, they want to go to Brisbane, to all the top schools in Australia. And that's the kind of friendly thought processes that are built in the mindsets of many Indonesians. And I'm talking about the young ones, which I think will make a difference. The first challenge in terms of managing, if not optimizing, on the relations between the two countries is that mindset. And that mindset can only be overcome by virtue of us hopefully having as many lunches as possible, like today, and as many Indonesians as possible sitting down with as many opinion makers as possible in Australia who can actually make a difference in educating and socializing the new Indonesia. Sure, Indonesia has certain negativities that the TVs have been portraying. That's the price we have paid for all the mistakes we've made. But the view-taking ought to be with respect to whether or not we've got the wherewithal to remedy these mistakes. And I'm a believer that at the rate we keep on educating ourselves, at the rate that we keep going through this political stabilization process, I think there's a good probability, barring catastrophic scenarios. The second is that the world is becoming more and more complex as the interaction between the two countries gets closer, as people travel from one place to another. Relationship does become more complex, and it does require a better way to manage that relationship.